Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 9th of April. My name is Brian Liddy. I'm here with a roundup of this week's news, and I'm pleased to say that I'm joined here in the studio virtually by two excellent guests. Hello, Huw, and good morning, Linda. How are you both? I'll introduce you in a second, but how are you both?
Absolutely grand. Happy Easter.
Yeah, thank you for...
I'm very good. I just realised I look like I'm wearing a my Easter monasterial outfit. It's not. It's just a hoodie.
You
I'm
look
not a
like
monk.
you look like you're angling for a hug, I would say, or something like that. So, Linda, you were an SNP, MSP for many years, and so you're going to bring a really useful perspective to today's show for us. And anybody who's maybe not familiar, Huw, you founded the National in Wales, and now you've got Talking Wales, a new national media platform for Wales. Welcome to the show.
That's hopefully will be launching towards the end of this year, beginning of the next year.
That's great. Look forward to that. So I'll start off today with our usual Ukraine update, day 410. Ukrainian forces are working to strengthen defensive lines and positions along the border with Belarus and Russia, the Defence Ministry has said, citing Lieutenant General Sergei Nayev, commander of the Joint Forces of Ukraine's armed forces. More than 30 children have returned to Ukraine and been reunited with their families after they were taken illegally to Russia, according to the Ukrainian organisation Save Ukraine. Children abducted by Russians from the Kherson and Kharkiv regions have been reunited with their families after several months of separation, it said. Russia's campaign to break down Ukraine's unified energy system within the past winter period has highly likely failed, the UK's Ministry of Defence said in its latest intelligence update. Large-scale, long-range attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure have become rare since early March. Ukraine's Ministry of Defence provided the latest figures on the conflict. It said 177,680 Russian troops have been killed and 7,020 armoured combat vehicles have been destroyed. Ukrainians have been marking the first anniversary of a missile strike on Kramatorsk railway station in eastern Ukraine, which killed at least 58 people, including several children. The attack took place on the 8th of April 2022, when the station was packed with women, children and elderly people waiting to be evacuated. Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Minister, Daparova, is due to visit India on Monday and will seek humanitarian aid and equipment to repair energy infrastructure damaged during Russia's invasion, in the first visit to India by a Ukrainian government minister since Russia's invasion. The US Justice Department has launched an investigation into the possible release of Pentagon documents. Documents posted on several social media sites, including Twitter, appear to detail US and NATO aid to Ukraine, but may have been altered or used as part of a misinformation campaign. So that's the update on the Ukraine. Normally I would ask whether either of you's got anything to say about that, because we're always conscious here that Ukraine has dropped kind of down the news items in mainstream media, but I don't know. I think maybe so we get more time to talk about what's been happening this week. I'm just going to crack on with our first item. So the Good Friday Agreement. The 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement is today, but of course it's not Friday today, it's Sunday, but so it could have been on Friday there, depending how you look on it. But that agreement ended years of violence in Northern Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreement's also locked Northern Ireland politicians into a power-sharing process. It's becoming clear that for the country to move on, there needs to be change. Let's see, so the Good Friday Agreement ended 30 years of conflict, and this week, if I can come back to, Bill Clinton said this week that Brexit was aimed right at the heart of the Good Friday Agreement, and he also went on to say that it was a miracle that it had survived. So, Linda, would you say that Brexit has put the Good Friday Agreement in the balance?
Yeah, I certainly think any progress that was getting made to go back to power sharing, the whole Brexit issue has very much hindered that. It's interesting. Before I retired, I was on a group called the British Irish Parliamentary Association, which was part of the Good Friday Agreement, a sort of complementary thing to keep people talking across the islands that form the British Isles. And it was very clear early on, and even in these discussions, that Brexit was causing a huge division and a huge issue for those of opposing politics in the north of Ireland. So it was very, very clear to us. It must therefore also have been very, very clear to the UK government, but they just ploughed on regardless with all the misinformation about Brexit and everything else. I mean, I would go as far as to say there was untruth told about the effect that Brexit would have, not just on the UK and very much in Scotland and Wales, but also in the north of Ireland. And there was huge efforts by the UK government to play all this down. Heard it over and over again at meetings, but it was very clear to all of us sitting in these discussions that this was a huge issue and it was just going to get worse. We've heard a lot lately about, how Rishi Sunak has come in and fixed it. Absolutely not convinced. Here we are, 25 years on, and we don't have an assembly that's meeting. That must be what, 3 years now, with just one or two meetings for specific issues. But the people in the north of Ireland must just be in despair about the lack of democracy in the land.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, I would say you're right there, and thank you for mentioning Rishi Sunak's update. I mean, you're referring to the Windsor framework there, which I think happened in February, and Huw, I mean, that Windsor framework. I mean, maybe before we go on to that, maybe it's worth saying why Brexit has been a spanner in the works when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement. It ended up with the possibility that there might be Brexit. When Brexit happened, there was then a strong chance that there would be a hard border down the middle of Ireland. And the only way that's been avoided is by Northern Ireland being given the special status that it has, which is the Windsor Framework, where it's got a foot in both the European Union trade bloc and still part of the UK. But I'm thinking also then, because Linda, you also mentioned storming and power sharing. So Huw, the Windsor Framework, it might make Brexit more palatable to unionists, but the DUP, they were opposed to Brexit, and now it seems that they're trying to use Brexit to get that hard border back. Can you maybe say something to make it a bit clearer what I'm trying to talk about here, what I'm rambling about?
I think it's a really difficult situation, because I was listening to an interview with somebody who was saying, sort of 25 years on, Ireland and the north of Ireland, things have changed, significantly during that time, and I think there's a feeling. Obviously, the Good Friday Agreement was so important in bringing peace between sort of Catholics and Unionists. But I think one of the issues is that because of the power sharing element, there are sections now within Northern Ireland who don't have a voice. So if you think of people like the SDLP, there are certain groups who who want to go back into Storm, want to be doing stuff, but they're not considered, and their voices aren't being heard. And I think, unfortunately, with the DUP, it's just say no. They say no to everything, and and I respect their stance, but it is quite getting it was amazing that getting Ian Paisley to agree to that was amazing, and it's brought peace, but it doesn't seem to have progressed because obviously under the power sharing agreement, it can't happen unless both sides agree, and it is the DUP who are using Brexit to stop that happening, and it looks with the Windsor framework the mood music sounds like the DUP aren't going to back it. So, it's a bad situation where you've got Northern Ireland as a constituent country within the United Kingdom haven't got a government in place. A devolved administration without a devolved government it just makes you wonder how actually things are functioning there.
Thank you, Huw. Something you touched on there, I think was really important. You mentioned Ian Paisley. That who was the fella in Sinn Féin that Paisley became best friends with eventually?
Martin McGuinness.
Martin McGuinness. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
if you think about the incredibly competent and reliable politicians like Mo Mowlam, who were all, I think everybody was agreed that it probably wouldn't have happened without her. And when you think about those kinds of divides being breached at that time, Ian Paisley and Mr McGuinness, as you said, Linda, thanks, and competitions that knew what they were doing and where they wanted to go and how to get there. And when you look at how it is now with Westminster and the DUP in Northern Ireland, it just, I don't know, it's like chalk and cheese. But so going back to Brexit, so the UK is set to impose more red tape on EU imports from this October coming. It was supposed to have done that 4 times already, but then seems to back out every time, which sounds like their fear, which should be a question I think I'll put to both of you. But there's even more. Physical checks are going to start in January 2024 at the border with Europe. So I will ask that question, Linda. What do you think? Westminster's just frightened?
I don't know if they're frightened. I suspect they're too arrogant to be frightened, really. I do think there's a huge there's a mixture going on. I don't think you should discount complete incompetence for a start in an awful lot of this stuff. But also, I think there's an elitism going on as well with those at the top, which is that they're not actually hugely badly affected by any of this, because those with resources and with the wealth in any situation tend to be able to get by. And I think one of the marks of the Tory government, this particular Tory government, more than any other, I would say, is that they don't actually care how it affects everybody else. It's a sort of laissez-faire, let the market prevail. And okay, if there's a lot of troubles, it doesn't really matter. But you know what? We're never going to admit we got anything wrong. And I think that's an issue as well. I don't think they're fear. No, I think they're just incompetent and brazen.
Thanks, Linda. Still not very complimentary, but yes, you're probably right. Huw, just going back to these changes that have never happened, or supposed to have happened, Britain was supposed to take back control, and it hasn't done that. It's planning to do it this October, and then there's more changes, physical changes coming in January. So Brexit's going to keep changing over the years, and are we going to have to keep going back and re-looking at the Good Friday Agreement and going back to Europe and changing it every time something happens?
It's a mess, basically, and I think it does, as you mentioned, it comes down to competence. When you look at the Good Friday Agreement, you did have people who were competent, who could sit down and discuss things. And I think today, there was the anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's death yesterday, and people were making the comparisons. Thatcher, by comparison with current Conservatives, was quite sort of left leaning. She was pro, the EU. And I think it's just this lurch to the right that the Conservative Party have taken, and the DUP. They seem to be becoming more extreme, and with the Brexit checks, it's kicking the can down the road, because there's going to be a general election in 18 months. They know that unfortunately, Labour don't seem to be making the point that it's a disaster, and look, we need to sort of relook at the whole issue again, because they're scared of sort of red wall voters. So it's a difficult situation, and you've got parties like the SNP, Plaid Cymru, and the Green Party who support going back into into the EU. And like I say, sadly, people were sold a pup. What they were sold has turned out to be, an utter disaster. And they were using Project Fear. If you look at places like Wales, strong trade, coming from Holyhead and from Fishguard to Ireland. Well, look at the number of sailings now that go directly from Ireland to Europe and just cut out sort of the UK mainland and Wales. It's having a huge impact on the economies in those places. But again, at the time it was said, "Oh, everything will be fine. It won't make any changes." But we're realising now, we're seeing the actual consequences of the action.
Thank you, Huw. So, yeah, just to wrap up on this before we move on to the next item, I think it's fair to say that Wales voted for Brexit, but only just. Scotland.
Yeah, it was 80,000 majority, which is the population of Wrexham, basically. But it was still majority, and there were majorities in places like the valleys, which were Labour strongholds. The old coal mining sort of areas where there's high levels of poverty.
Yeah, of course. And Scotland voted famously against Brexit, and so, but all I was going to say is Northern Ireland's in this incredible situation that I think both now Wales and both Scotland would give their eye teeth for, where they're still part of the UK and freedom of trade and movement within the UK and still part of the EU. So I'll move on to the next item, which is Donald Trump. In an historic first, Donald Trump became the first ex-president to be indicted of 34 alleged breaches of New York state laws. Well, this might boost his chances of becoming the Republican nominee at the next presidential election. Has it ended his chance of becoming president again? And meanwhile, I don't know if you saw it, but on Thursday there were black representatives in Tennessee. Justin Pearson and Justin Jones were expelled from the Tennessee House of Representatives for protesting against gun violence and the GRA. Huw, I'll come to you first because I went to Linda first the last time. But in America, it's supposed to be a democracy, but Justin Pearson, when he was being expelled from the House in Tennessee, he said that in America they were losing democracy to white supremacism and patriarchy. And we need to get back onto actually talking about Trump. But would you say that is that correct?
Yeah, and I think Trump is a symptom, of the polarization of politics. Trump is, the extreme. He's just out there for himself. He's a corrupt megalomaniac. And it's quite safe to use those words because obviously, he's, been indicted now with those charges. And I think, to a certain extent, every time sort of the Democrats, the left, if you call the Democrats the left, or the centre and the left, try and throw something against Trump, it just makes his supporters more determined. But I'd imagine that when you look at those places that vote Trump, it is it's not the urban areas, it's older white people who do support Trump, and it's quite similar here with the Conservatives. So I don't know. It's it's a difficult one, but it's just again it's the polarization. I think social media has allowed these people to find each other. Before they were like lone wolves, but social media has allowed them to discover each other and create these packs. And like I say, the business with Fox News, with them actually admitting, that they knew that Trump was lying, and they didn't want to upset their audiences by, telling the truth. Basically, just tells you everything you need to know. It's quite a depressing situation. I think the only positive that young people are more progressive, and I wouldn't say left leaning, but they're just more intelligent, and they're more sensible. So over time things will change, but we've got a period where people of my generation and older, unfortunately, are taking us down a very dodgy path at the moment.
Thank you, Huw. Linda, I'm hoping you managed to wring some sense out of that gobbledygook that I was speaking at the start of this item. Do you think that Trump, if he does go to prison, that he'll become a martyr and therefore more likely to win the next presidential election?
Oh, Lordy me. Do you know, I keep hoping to have more faith in the American populace, you know, the US populace. Every time something happens, I think, oh no, nothing else can happen. People are surely waking up now. But I'm rapidly losing that faith. I think when I look at state by state, you know, the lurch to the right that Hugh's been talking about, and I think it's a really interesting issue. The fact that social media has allowed people to come together, you know, of a certain persuasion and get validation. We all know that social media can be an echo chamber, so they get validation for their views. If you couple that with a right-wing media like Fox, like the example that Huw used, who quite willingly are economical with the truth and have now even admitted that they let lies go out there on national news. I lose more and more faith when you see what happened in Tennessee, when you see how many states are hammering against the rights of women. There's been some good wee bits here and there that have happened, like little chinks of light in some of the darkness, but it's really difficult. And you know, I read something about Wisconsin earlier on in the week that gave me some, you know, some faith that things were moving on. And it was, you know, I don't, for a start, see there. It worries me that judges to the Supreme Court are, you know, elected sometimes, because when you see some things that go on in certain communities and who are they going to elect. But Wisconsin did elect a liberal minded judge to the Supreme Court. So that's really good news. But back to your original thing, Trump, would he become a martyr? He would to these people. I think he's already a martyr to a lot of people. I mean, it fascinates me that, you know, well, it fascinates me if he gets a Republican nomination. I mean, the Republican Party, when you look back at their history, there's a lot of honour there that they have completely and utterly lost. And so if they nominate this megalomaniac, this narcissist, for president, he could still win the presidency, even if he was in jail. Seems most bizarre to me. And I know it's because they never ever thought it would happen. And so, but surely there is no one who would think it's acceptable to elect someone that's in jail to the presidency. So if that happened, yes, he would be a martyr, very, very much so. I don't know if he'll go to jail. We may have to wait and see what happens there. But I understand there's an awful lot of other things going on that he could also be indicted for. So I guess it's a watch this space. But I don't envy Joe Biden at the moment, you know, having to deal with all of this and everything else that's going on in the United States. Yeah.
Thank you, Linda.
Sorry
Yeah,
to be so depressed, but Huw and I have been just very depressive about that whole item. But
well, I think it's probably
let's have faith in humanity. Faith in humanity. It's what we have to have.
yeah, I think you can probably blame us for choosing these topics and asking you to talk about them on your Easter Sunday, but we do appreciate it. Thank you. So I mentioned Justin Pearson, but not very cogently. So Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and Glory Johnson. Also, before I go on to this, sorry, Linda, you mentioned Wisconsin, and we covered that particular story really well if viewers want to go back with Kat Carey on Wednesday's show. So I would recommend that to any viewers if you want to find out more about what's going on in Wisconsin and how that's affecting things in American politics. But Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, and Glory Johnson are three people who were part of Tennessee state government. Tennessee state representatives, and they were expelled over their protest for gun controls and against the GRA. Justin Pearson and Justin Jones were expelled, but Glory Johnson was allowed to stay. And of course, it turns out that Pearson and Jones are both young black men. Johnson's a white woman. Linda, did you see Broadcasting Scotland here? We retweeted some tweets that shows them speaking, and Justin Jones especially sounds very reminiscent of Martin Luther King. Did you get to see that, or have you anything to offer?
Well, first of all, can I say that I'm not on Twitter anymore because I just got really fed up with the cesspit that it has become. So no, I didn't see the Twitter clips, but I have taken the time to look into some of this because I always think it's really interesting how different legislators deal with protest. And I understand that both Justins, Pearson and Jones, went down with a loud protest into the well of the hall of the Assembly, whatever you want to call it. And Glory, is it Glory or Gloria Johnson?
Glory Johnson, I believe.
Glory Johnson, she stood up in solidarity. So they were, stripped of their office, and she wasn't. Now, I would actually hesitate on the basis of that one event to say it was overtly racist, because there's a difference in how they actually protested. However, evidence has certainly come out that both Justins have been targeted by the Grand Old Party, as they call it, over some time as troublemakers and all the rest of it. So there may well have been a racist element in the treatment of them ongoing that has culminated in what has happened. I have heard Justin Pearson, I get my two Justins mixed up. I think it's Justin Pearson whose pieces have been widely circulated. And yes, he's a marvellous orator. I mean, I have to say, it didn't immediately make me think of Martin Luther King. What he made me think of was actually Barack Obama. And the reason being because by chance, many years ago, I turned on the TV and I heard Barack Obama speaking at a Democrat conference. I was actually in New York and it was all getting well covered. And I remember thinking, oh my, that man's very, very special. And I think he'll be going places. I got that same feeling when I listened to Justin Pearson. This is a wonderfully articulate person who has a passion and speaks from the heart that people will listen to. And I'm sure he'll be going places. It'll be interesting to see what now happens, because I understand from my reading that if there's what we would call a by-election for the places for Justin Pearson and Justin Jones, they can stand for re-election. There's nothing to stop that happening. And I would hope that faith in humanity that I was talking about earlier on would make sure that they were returned with a big majority. And I think there's also a mechanism whereby the local authority can give them these places back. So again, it's a watch this space in terms of how things are happening in the US at the moment.
Thank you, Linda. So you think maybe Pearson might be a potential future candidate for president, US president?
Well, there's a lot of talented people out there, and one of the things I've always said is that it's not just talent and it's not just ability, it takes you places. You need to throw a bit of luck and happenstance in as well. So I think it's a bit soon to be making any kind of predictions there.
Yeah, and thank you for your hesitancy to call it out as racism. But Glory Johnson, just before we wrap up on this, Glory Johnson, I saw her being interviewed and she was asked why she thought these two young men were banned or expelled and she wasn't. And she said, oh, well, clearly it's because they're black and I'm a white woman. So she seemed to think that it was racist. But we'll move on to the next item. So this week, the Labour Party has, let me see if I can get my notes. Labour has been accused of casting its core values adrift recently and being seen more and more as being closer to the Conservative Party in the UK. a recent Redfield and Winton poll asked voters in the Red Wall who they trusted most on issues like the NHS and housing. NHS, housing, economy, immigration and Ukraine. For the NHS, 40% trusted Labour as opposed to 19% trusting the Tories. For housing, it was 37% trusted Labour, only 19% trusted the Tories again. For the economy, it was 33% trusted Labour, only 26% trusted the Tories, and so it goes on. So Linda and Huw, but Huw first, that Winton and Redfield and Winton poll, it excludes Scotland and Wales. It really just talks about Labour, the UK and Conservatives, and they only polled people in the Red Wall. In Wales, you've got Welsh Labour, and here in Scotland, we've got Scottish Labour. Is there a similarity or a difference between Labour in Scotland and Wales? How do you see the relationship between Labour and different parts?
I think there's a huge difference between Labour in Wales and Labour in the UK, particularly. But I think there are big differences between Labour in Wales and Labour in Scotland. Whereas, when we look at the news, you tend to see that in Scotland it's Labour and the Conservatives with, SNP bad about everything, even though, the performance of the Scottish government under the SNP is better than that of the Conservatives in Westminster and Labour in Wales. But Labour have got a cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru that they work collaboratively. They've got a good working relationship because as Adam Price, the leader of Plaid, and Mark Drake for the leader of Labour, it's grown up politics. You've got to work together for the better of the better good, for the people. And working together, they've been able to deliver things like free school meals, which is being rolled out across every primary school in Wales. So there are benefits. They work together. I think people forget that Mark Drakeford, was a Corbyn ally. Starmer was talking at the Welsh Labour conference recently, and he refused to confirm that a Labour government would give Wales parity with under the Barnett formula with HS2, because obviously Wales contributes something, billions to that, and there's not an inch of HS2. I think the closest it comes to is Crewe, even if it manages to get there eventually. So, and I think there are big differences, and there's obviously, the news this week where you've got the Conservatives in Scotland, telling people to vote tactically to vote Labour to keep the SNP out. You would never get that happening in Wales. And I think the Tories in Wales are very much closer to the Tories in England. You've got the leader, Andrew R.T. Davis, who's spending all his time talking about small boats. That's all. It's down to culture wars now. That's all they've got left in the box. So I think there are big differences there. But I think people forget. Labour have been in power in Wales for 20 years, and things like the NHS in Wales is worse than anywhere else in the UK. But I think it comes down to the fact that we have less powers in Wales, and Labour in Wales is more of, they're basically administering on behalf of the Conservatives, because the only things that are devolved in reality are health, education, but the funding isn't. So, we haven't got the power we've got some tax raising powers, limited, but, they don't make any use of those.
Thanks, Huw. I mean, you mentioned the fact that Drakeford was a Corbynite, which reminded me that was also the case here in Scotland. Anas Sarwar, the leader of the Scottish Party, he was pro-Corbyn until he changed his mind, which was when Starmer asked him to leave the party, or told him to leave. I'd just like to go on, Linda. This week in the news, Douglas Ross has said that Labour candidates should be endorsed by Scottish Tories. And I'm just wondering, that reminded me of, so that's like Labour in Scotland working with the Conservatives. But I wonder if you were in Holyrood as an MSP, because it reminded me of when Kezia Dugdale made a similar remark when she told her Labour voters to vote Tory. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, that was immediately what came to my mind as well, Brian, when I saw that stuff about Douglas Ross. Oh my goodness, where to start with this one? You know, he was speaking earlier on about the disappointing lurch to the right that Labour has taken under Keir Starmer, and it's hugely disappointing. I mean, you know, from Brexit on, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn was he was very lukewarm about the European Union from a left perspective. You know, therefore, I thought didn't do enough on the side of you know, Remain. But when I think of Keir Starmer, I remember watching him in the House of Commons, you know, being appalled at Brexit and speaking some real sense, making some really good speeches, pointing out all the disadvantages of Brexit. And here we have him now, you know, alongside the Tories, not just in Brexit, but in so many other abhorrent policies that the Tories have, frightened to make waves because he sees that as the way into government. I'm appalled by all of that. And it actually, I know I'm going on a bit about the UK thing and the questions about Scotland, but it all ties in because it's like power at any cost. You know, what happened to people that stood for election because they absolutely believed in something and you do what's right? And unfortunately, we see that in the Scottish Parliament as well. It's all about power. And of course, in Scotland, you have the added dimension of the unionism. So, Kezia Dugdale for Labour at one point telling people to vote Tory. You've got Douglas Ross now telling people to vote Labour. And it's all about stopping the democratic will of Scotland if Scotland wants to be independent. So it's better together all over again. That's more important to them because they are branch offices, let's face it. You know, you had Keir Starmer, I think it was this week, admitting that he'd got Richard Leonard, who was a Corbynite, sacked. It's a branch office, so they do what they're told. So it's about maintaining that union above all else. I find it absolutely awful. But it's the way it is, it's what we're dealing with. And I'm interested in what Huw was saying about Labour in Wales, because we in Scotland look down at Wales and actually think that Mark Drakeford appears to stand up for Wales in a way that Labour in Scotland doesn't stand up for Scotland. And it may be it's just that difference at looking at something from afar rather than being, you know, sitting amongst it. It may be the difference about them being in power in Wales and in opposition in Scotland. But in a way, I think it's quite clear what Mark Drakeford stands for, but I don't know what Labour in Scotland stands for anymore at all, other than trying to get rid of the SNP. So I'm actually not surprised that Tory and Labour are joining together again.
Thank you, Linda. I think you hit the nail on the head more than once there. I would say at least 3 times by my count. Huw, this thing about Scottish Labour, Welsh Labour and the Labour Party UK-wide, so we have these, they look and they sound or they claim to be different parties, but really it's all just Labour. They're not even separately registered with the Electoral Commission, but do you think that's a problem for Starmer? Should the difference be more pronounced officially, or should it just be just one big Labour Party?
Well, I think he benefits from it in Wales. People in Wales will be voting Labour. I think the latest poll had them at something like 49%. You know, so at the next general election for Westminster, you know, Labour will take the majority of seats in Wales. But people in Wales, are they voting for Drakeford's Labour, which is a progressive socialist, sort of party that does put the interest of Wales first, and they're unionists, but with a small U, as opposed to Starmer, who obviously is saying that the union is precious and everything. He's happy to be sort of stood in front of Union Jacks, so he'll benefit from that, and I think that's where the dynamic. I think Starmer has probably more power over the Labour Party in Scotland because they're weaker in Scotland, whereas in Wales, they do have a power base. But I know, sort of Labour are looking at, they discussed it. I think they discussed it at this year's conference about separating, sort of Welsh Labour, because they are basically, it's the same party. They're like, as Linda was saying, it's a branch office, and I think there's more independent thought, in Labour in Wales. Which is why, to a certain extent, is why they're popular. Drakeford has parked, a lot of his tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawn and done it quite successfully, where Plaid Cymru has struggled to break through in sort of Labour heartlands. So no, I think Starmer will benefit from it in Wales. He's promised to give Wales more powers, but as we know, what happens at the next election. But then after that, when the Conservatives have regrouped, sort of licked their wounds, and they'll be electable again, because we know historically that England, which is, don't forget, it's 84% of the UK population vote Conservative, more often than less. Wales has never voted, a Conservative majority, and I don't think Scotland has voted a Tory majority since the 1950s. You're talking, we're getting on to a century. So, things are different. And I think that's what we need to realise, is the politics in England. Starmer is playing to that audience. Everything he does, everything he says, you can tell it's been focus grouped to death. He's going after, the Red Wall, the Mumsnet, the Daily Mail commenters. He's in a position to be going for something progressive, but he isn't. He's more concerned about not, trying to gain those Tory voters rather than giving people a progressive outlook, which is, for me, is quite depressing.
Thanks, Huw. I think you might be right. I think Starmer realises that essentially he doesn't really have to care what Scottish Labour or Welsh Labour say, because all he needs to do is win that vote in that big English, 85% of the English population, as you say. But Linda, what kind of advice would you give to Anas Sarwar to Scottish Labour, to make the party more progressive, maybe, or if he's going to get more voters in Scotland? What would you say?
I would say be a Democrat. Be a Democrat and say Scotland is entitled to make up its own mind about how it wants its constitutional future. Therefore, no one should stand in the way of Scotland's voice in a referendum. That's what Anas Sarwar should do.
Thanks, Linda.
And I think, just add to that, I think Drakeford has said, I think Drakeford would respect the views of the people of Wales. What he's saying is that, obviously at the last election, Plaid Cymru polled, 19%, I think, in the Senedd elections. So, there isn't a majority voting for independence. But I'm sure he said that, but if people did vote that way, then that would be respected. And I think, that it's sad really that Drakeford's going to be going soon. He's going to be replaced by someone else, because he said that he will go before the end of this term, and he'll be replaced by somebody. So, who comes after him? But I think people underestimate Drakeford as how, people talk about Sturgeon being, an excellent politician. I think, Drakeford has to, you have to realise he's up there as well. He's been an excellent First Minister.
Thank you, Huw. Just something that you touched on there earlier. I think it was. I think the very fact that Labour in Wales is willing to form a collaboration with Plaid Cymru, I can't imagine Labour in Scotland ever doing anything similar with the
And
SNP.
Starmer has said that he won't do a deal with the SNP, and I assume by that with Plaid Cymru. So they're doing it in Wales, but he won't do it in Westminster. So make of that what you will.
So just a yes or no answer from both of you quickly before we move on. So do you think that Labour in Scotland and Labour in Wales, it's more like unionism trumps socialism?
Yes, at the end of the day.
Linda?
Mm.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. It's quite something, isn't it? Okay, so I'll move on to the next item, which is the Scottish National Party. So the SNP have been spending years under constant siege by hostile media. That cannot be good for anybody's psyche, but when a party keeps winning election after election, the challenge is not to develop a mixture of siege mentality and hubris. The SNP now have an opportunity for change and to rebuild itself, and with it the future of Scotland. But that future has to be built on trust and openness with the people of Scotland. So, Linda, would you agree or disagree with that as a statement?
Well, I think it's a fairly broad brush statement. There's an awful lot of nuances need to be in there as well. But as a broad brush statement, yes, I would agree with it.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And what about yourself, Huw?
Well, because it's been interesting from watching what's been going on in the last week from afar, because obviously it's all been about what's been happening with the arrest, and we saw the tents, we saw the police, we saw all of that. What hasn't been is a discussion about what the alleged issues are. There hasn't been a discussion about who's made the complaint, who's behind the allegations. We're just seeing one side of the story, and you could say from a media perspective that it's a good news story. Look at the scandal close to the to Nicola Sturgeon. Did she know? Is this why she resigned? So you're going to get a lot of stuff like that. But I think it is interesting. When you change leaders and you've had somebody as incredible as Sturgeon, it's going to be difficult for a party. And I think the SNP are far, they're more mature than Plaid Cymru. But we look at Plaid Cymru, it's a broad church. Independence is the thing that unites most people within Plaid Cymru. But you've got people across the political spectrum across there. And when you get changes of leadership, you do tend to get those factions breaking out and trying to jostle for position under the new leadership. So,
Yeah.
Interesting times.
Thanks, Huw. So Linda, at the moment we've got Mr. Murrell is now a suspect in a police investigation, and if evidence is found, he'll be charged, and either found guilty or innocent, I suppose. And we've got contempt of court also to be cautious of. But that thing about, Huw, you mentioned the media and how it looks. Linda, what did you think when you saw the tents outside the front door and how that was kind of being portrayed in the media?
Well, I was actually away for a few days, and of course, waking up in the morning to this news and was, gobsmacked, I suppose is the word to use, totally shocked by it. Of course, it's all in the hands of the Crown Prosecution Service now. I thought what was really interesting was what you said there about the perspective of those who are Firth of Scotland and wondering what the heck's going on. But I've had loads of folk come on to me and say, what's this about? What's this about? Because they're not really understanding. And my concern is that there's actually people out there that think there's been some kind of, I don't know, how would you say it? Misappropriation of funds rather than a misapplication potential of funds, which is what the complaint was actually about that prompted all this. It was about raising money for a specific purpose and perhaps using it for a different purpose. So actually, when you look at it, and then you look at, and this is when I start to get angry, and when I look at some of the shenanigans going on down at Westminster with public money, not money that has been raised through a campaign from, I would imagine, largely party members. But when you look at the misappropriation of funds from the public that has happened down south, I look at it and I think, why has Michelle Moore not been taken in for full questioning yet and arrested? You know, all the millions on the scandals of the PPE and everything else, the dirty dealings that go on with the Westminster government all the time, just seem to get washed over. And so there is I get that it's because Nicola Sturgeon was the leader of the party as well as First Minister, and she resigned, and there's all this talk. But do you know what? You can take two random facts and create a conspiracy theory about anything you like. And I think there's an awful lot of that going on as well just now. So I think we just have to keep calm, let the police and the Crown Office do their job, and let's see what comes out. Meanwhile, the party has a new leader who will be supported by the membership of the SNP, who is a very, very decent man and has already promised to allow more insight and transparency into the workings of the party for its members, and that's very, very important. The members of the SNP are the most important thing in relation to the role of leader of the SNP, and that's very separate from being First Minister of Scotland. So Humza Yousaf has two roles to fulfil, and from what I have seen so far, he is progressing well in both of them.
Thank you, Linda. You actually pipped me there, because I was going to bring up the fact that this missing monies, it's not taxpayers' money, it's donations that people have made. And a lot of people, I've seen them on social media saying, when I gave that money to the SNP, it was up to them how they wanted to spend it, as long as it was for independence. And you mentioned Michelle Moon, I think quite rightly. But I think there's also this thing about the footage of the tent outside the house and media perception. Do you think, is there a sense that actual media coverage could be itself contempt of court, just because it will sort of shape public perspective, and I would say probably in a negative way, because it looks like there's been a murder's been committed. Huw, maybe, how does it look from where you are in Wales?
Yeah, but like I say, I won't comment on the actual thing, but it's just very strange for a case that involves, sort of financial, whatever the thing is, that there's a tent, a forensic tent placed in front of a property. I've never seen anything like that before. And like Linda was saying, because I think I tweeted in the week, sort of, where are the tents outside Rishi Sunak's house? People forget that he is the Prime Minister and the architect, who oversaw, 56 billion pounds worth of fraud with the PP and the, and the COVID contracts, which is public money, and it's just been written off, and nobody, is saying anything about it. And it is the double standards. It's a relatively small amount of money. It wasn't public money. It was donations. So whatever happens, there's no comparison there. But the fact is, they're trying to create those things. And I think in the long term, it'll probably backfire, because I think it just makes people more determined. And because of the polarization, people think, well, they're doing this on purpose. They're trying to make us look bad, and it'll probably sort of strengthen people who support independence in the long term.
Is there anything in? I mean, when I think about, when I watch the media coverage, and it makes me remember things like Cliff Richard, when there was an aerial helicopter camera following him when he had been accused of child abuse, I think it was, wasn't it? And it turned out the BBC lost that case. And then Rebecca Brooks and the Daily Mail and the phone tapping scandal. I think I'm right in saying that, didn't the police find a missing laptop in her bin at the back of the garden or whatever? So I mean, I can see why they need to secure the area. And again, I'm floundering here, but yeah, you would think that the evidence would be spreadsheets and documents like that. Linda, can you maybe rescue me in the last final minutes by saying something sensible?
No. All I was going to say, Brian, was It will be interesting to see what comes out. The other thing that came into my mind with the Crown Office in Scotland was the whole Rangers debacle. Remember, the directors of Rangers were hammered for a few years by the Crown Office, and then the Crown Office had to admit that they'd got it completely wrong. And they're still talking, I think, about the compensation that's got to be paid out to those folk. So, as I say, we have to just wait and see what happens and what comes out. It did look incredibly heavy-handed, I have to say. But then there was also a bit of reporting that wasn't quite right. You know, they were talking about the police digging up the garden. I understand from what I've since read that that wasn't at all true. It was just a photograph of a policeman who'd lifted a garden spade out the way. So there's an awful lot there that we don't know yet. But of course, under contempt of court, rightly so, there's an awful lot of things can't be spoken. And then, you know, then we had the auditors' story. It was reported that the auditors had dumped the SNP, and then the auditors came out and said, well, we actually made that decision a while ago because we were re-looking at our client lists. And I'll go back to what I said. It's, you know, you can pick any two random issues and create a conspiracy theory about it. And oh my goodness, the conspiracists have been going wild on this one.
Thank you, Linda. You just reminded me, I remember one day I saw a tweet which said, if the rumour is true about the SNP, and it was a bit like clickbait, and I kind of thought to myself, well, what's the rumour? And so I did a quick search of Twitter for SNP, and there were so many different rumours that came up. It was really quite enlightening.
Yeah.
Huw, I don't know, can I just give you the last word, perhaps? How does it look from where you are in Wales?
Yeah, well, I think this is the issue. You know, it'll come out when the investigation is concluded. So, in the meantime, everything is conjecture. You know that it. You know, as Linda was saying. You know that I read that it was the police had gone into the back garden, hadn't looked in the shed, and there were two shovels, and he was picking up the shovels. You know, so they admitted, you know, that was reported as fact, you know, that had been dug up, and they had to correct that element of it. So I don't know. It's just the way that the media works. You know, it's clicks, it's stories. You know, if they can generate traffic to their website, so people will see adverts, then you know, news companies will do that. You know, it's just the nature of the business now, and you know, sadly, with these issues, it should all be kept, you know, under wraps until, you know, somebody's been charged, or you know, or there's been a court case and we've had a conclusion to it. Because until then, it is literally just people just making stuff up.
Thank you, Huw. And I think I'll maybe just be a wee bit cheeky by finishing on my favourite joke from social media, which said that the tent was there because the police are looking for the remains of Scottish Labour, which kind of fits what we've been talking about today. Linda, thank you very much for giving up part of your Easter Sunday and joining us. Huw, also, thank you very much. So that's about it for this weekend. I'll let you all get back to the rest of your lives, because that's it for the full Scottish this week. But before I go, I just wanted to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes, you know, will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now, we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay for our bills and to ensure that we are able to continue making more programmes for you. So, goodbye and thank you for watching.